Good morning. My name's David Harrington, and I'm an Education Ranger at Greater Sydney Parklands. I'm coming to you today from beautiful Biddigal Land in southeast Sydney, and today I'm joined by Associate Professor Kelsey Dadd.
I'm the Program Director with Curious Minds, which is a program for talented high school girls in STEM. We target regional, remote, Indigenous and disadvantaged girls. But before I took on that role, I spent about 25 years as an academic in geology, mainly at Macquarie University. So what is geology? Sometimes we call it earth science. It's a field that seeks to understand how the earth works. We look at the continents and the oceans, the rocks and the sediments they contain, and we read in these the history of the earth.
Where I live on the coast, there's lots of beautiful sandstone cliff faces, and I think everybody from around Sydney and even up in the Blue Mountains would be familiar with this type of rock. Can you tell me what it's called and how it formed?
So the beautiful, distinctive yellow-orange sandstone that we see around Sydney is called the Hawkesbury sandstone. The sand and the mud that makes up the Hawkesbury sandstone was laid down in a giant river system that flowed from large mountains to the south and the west. The Hawkesbury sandstone itself stretches from the Blue Mountains up to the Hunter Valley and down south to about inland of Gerringong on the south coast. And it covers about 20,000 square kilometres. Now, the Hawkesbury sandstone is part of a much larger area of sedimentary rock that we call the Sydney Basin.
So, Kelsey, you said that this rock was laid down in a huge river. Can you tell us how long ago that was? Paint us a picture of what that world was like. Were there dinosaurs?
The Hawkesbury sandstone was deposited in a time that geologists call the Triassic. So 240 million years ago, Australia was part of a supercontinent called Pangaea. And Pangaea consisted of all of the continents that we know around the globe, all together in one large continent. And Australia within Pangaea was located at quite high southern latitudes. That means we were a long way south. And actually, the South Pole was in eastern Australia. But the world at that time was quite warm. So it was overall warmer and drier than it is today, and there were no ice caps. So even though we were at the South Pole, it wasn't all that cold. There were dinosaurs at this time in other parts of the world, but when the Hawkesbury sandstone was laid down around Sydney, there weren't any really large dinosaurs that we think of like Jurassic Park. We do find the fossils of fish and also an animal that's called a labyrinthodont. It was a large amphibian. So it was about the size of a crocodile, about 2 metres in length, and we have some wonderful fossils of these in the Sydney area.
So were there any volcanoes? Is there any evidence of volcanoes around Sydney?
You might be surprised to hear that there were volcanoes around Sydney. So a little bit more recently, this is 170 million years ago, in what's called the Jurassic time period, which I'm sure you've heard of, Sydney had volcanoes. There were quite a lot of these volcanoes. And we don't actually see the volcanoes anymore, but we see the rocks that they left behind. And we can see evidence for those volcanoes at places like Hornsby, Erskine Park, Minchinbury and Avalon.
So did that ancient environment affect the different patterns in the sandstone? What creates those patterns and differences?
The Hawkesbury sandstone does have lots of lovely colours and patterns in it. But when a geologist looks at the Hawkesbury sandstone, the first thing that we see are some of these structures and patterns that were formed as the sediment was laid down by that giant river system. The beautiful colours that you see in the rock, these lovely swirls of orange and yellow, they formed much later and more likely as the rock was being uplifted, eroded and weathered. And they form due to the action of water moving through the rocks. When that water with its iron comes to an environment that's quite rich in oxygen, the iron deposits as iron oxide. Now that iron oxide has shades of yellow, orange and brown, and iron oxide is essentially rust. So just like metals rust, the water forms a rust-like material in these rocks to give those lovely colours.
So I expect that Sydney sandstone is fantastic for building with because so much of Sydney's old buildings are made from it. What makes it such a good building material?
You're right, many of the old buildings around Sydney are built of the Hawkesbury sandstone. But it's not because it was a great building stone. It's pretty good, but it was mainly because it was so abundant and it was close to hand and relatively easy to work with. The sandstone itself is made of grains of silica sand. and they're held together with more silica or with clay. So the sand itself, the particles are quite hard, but the clay that holds it together can sometimes be weak, and the sandstone blocks can start to crumble. And so if you look carefully at some of the old buildings in the city, you'll see some of the blocks starting to weather away and crumble.
So thank you so much for your interesting answers today, Kelsey. I really appreciate you coming and talking to me.
That's my pleasure. I love talking about the rocks that we see around us, and the Hawkesbury Sandstone is one that's a really wonderful rock.